All right, last week we finished our series where we were looking at Jesus' ministry during that year of popularity that Jesus had. Basically, they divide his ministry into roughly three parts: a year of obscurity, a year of popularity, and then a year of opposition from the others. We're going to look at the last part now of that year of opposition. We're going to look at Jesus' trip from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry and eventual crucifixion. I'm calling this series On the Road Again, mostly because I couldn't think of a better one. I'm not that good at coming up with titles, but it does highlight the fact that Jesus is teaching certain things on the road to his death. And today we're going to be in Luke chapter 9, and if you want to turn to verse 18, that's where I'm going to pick up here in just a few minutes. It's a parallel passage to what Kevin read for us here just a few minutes ago. And I'm going to highlight some of the differences here in just a few minutes if you want to turn to Luke chapter 9. The message this morning is called Transitions. And I'm going to look at how Jesus prepared for a major change. That concept of change is something that isn't very popular in our lives, is it? We don't really like change. Change for us is viewed as something scary. It's not comfortable to deviate from what we've always done. It's comfortable to know what we've done in the past, and we're going to keep doing it today, and tomorrow we're going to do it the same, to the point where we just do it by reflex. It's less scary than when we recreate the wheel, as some people have said. Well, we're just doing a function. It's the same function we've always done. It might be Vacation Bible School or the block party or whatever it would be. We've always done it this way. Why do we need to change? Never stopping to consider that we may not have changed, but our community has. So it's a little bit scary to face change. It can also be confusing to face change. Whenever we do something different than we have in the past, the leaders of the church are addressed a lot more frequently with, what do I do next? Before, we always knew. We just did the next thing the same way we did last time. But now things have changed. And I'm not sure what comes next. And so I better check before I make the mistake. It can also be painful. We get a lot of comfort out of our traditions, don't we? A lot of comfort out of doing things the way we've always done them. And other types of changes are painful as well. I mean, when people leave or new people come, there can be discomfort from that. When places change, when we do Sunday school in a different room, it changes the atmosphere, and it's not as pleasant. When we do worship service, perhaps in a different order, I'm not suggesting that. Please don't take that as a suggestion. But if we were to do the announcements before the opening hymn, people would be confused and feel a little violated. And some people will just tell you outright they've already had too much change. I remember the story my grandmother used to tell. My grandmother was born in 1910. And she can remember when World War I ended. And for the first time in her life, she saw a World War I era fabric-covered biplane. She saw it flying through the sky, and it terrified her so much that she gathered all the siblings and took them all to the cellar and waited for Mom and Dad to get home. She told me that story the same day she told me about all the things, exciting things happened as she flew from the United States to London to see her daughter and son-in-law. In her lifetime, she went from terrified of a plane flying over to sitting in an airliner crossing the Atlantic. There have been a lot of changes like that. People have gone from reading the news in a newspaper to reading the news on the internet. People have gone from telegraphs, just a little over 100 years ago, to telephones, to video chat. It's amazing when you look at the last 100 years or so and see all the changes that have taken place. It's no wonder people want things to just settle down and be the same for a while. But even Jesus had to face changes. And in this passage that we're looking at this morning, we're going to see how Jesus faced a significant change in his life and how that can teach us how to deal with change as it comes in our life. I'm going to start in chapter 9, verse 18. It says, "Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples came to him." Praying alone. The other passage, the one that Kevin read for us out of Mark earlier, Mark chapter 16, it gives us more detail. He was praying by himself, but he was actually praying in the region of a community called Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, we know from looking at our Bible maps in the back of our Bible, is near Mount Hermon, which is considerably north of Palestine. This is the only time we know of where Jesus actually left Palestine. And he took his disciples north of Palestine, north of the Sea of Galilee, to the headwaters of the Jordan River. And as he was praying there, he would have been able to look down at the side of the mountain. There was a cave. And out of this cave came a spring. And that water became part of, it wasn't all of, but it became part of the headwaters of the Jordan River. It flowed down through the Jordan Rift and filled up the Sea of Galilee and eventually went to the Dead Sea. Outside of that cave was a temple. It was a temple to the Greek god Pan. The Greek god Pan was the Greek version of the god who governed mischief and chaos. And it was a very popular temple where people would come from all over the Greek world to worship Pan in the temple that was right outside of this cave, and the cave had a name. The name of the cave was the Gates of Hades. If you remember when Kevin was reading, he said to his disciples, "The gates of Hades will not prevail over his church." We need to keep that background in mind as we read the rest of what Luke says here. I'll start over at verse 18 again. He says, "Now it happened that he was praying alone. The disciples were with him, and he asked them, 'Who do the crowds say that I am?' And they answered, 'John the Baptist. But others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old have risen.' Then he said to them, 'But who do you say I am?' And Peter answered, 'The Christ of God, the anointed one of God.'" That's a pretty impetuous confession, isn't it? That fits Peter's mode of operation, doesn't it? It's always the first one to speak, and he's always saying something radical. If you read the four Gospels, Peter seems to be presented as that guy that always speaks before he thinks, and he never gets it right. Jesus is always correcting him. He tried to step out of the boat and walk on water, and he sank. He tried to answer Jesus on several occasions and had to be corrected. But this time, and all the Gospels recorded, this time Peter got it right. And Jesus changed his name officially to Peter at that point. It means a stone like you'd hold in your hand. And he said, "On this rock," which is the word for a boulder. They both come from the Greek word Petra. "He will build the church," as he looks down at the Greeks worshiping a false god. And it really expands the declaration that Peter made, "You are the one God has chosen." And again, in the Matthew version, it adds to that, "the Son of God," which would have, in the eyes of the Jews, put Peter in the same category as those Greek pagans. Because God, in the Old Testament, according to the Jews, is one. And they didn't understand the concept of the Trinity and that one God could be three people. And by the way, we don't understand it either. We just accept it. But that declaration was enough to get Peter stoned. Great big stones to death in the presence of an Orthodox Jew. So he's really making a significant statement when he looks at his environment and says, you're the one God anointed over all of this. Luke goes on and records Jesus' reaction to that, and it's kind of an unusual reaction. In verse 21, he says, and he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one. Now, we have a hard time understanding that. If Jesus is really the Messiah, why doesn't he want everybody to know? He should want these guys to go out and tell everybody that he can't. They can. But would it surprise you to know that when he said this, he didn't make it a command? Neither one of those words, the word charged or commanded, are in the imperative tense of the verse, of the word. Neither one of those is a, you have to do this. Neither one of these words are formed in a way that it's obligatory on them. It's more of a very strong suggestion or a warning. The same way the Matthew version said it. He warned them not to tell anyone. So it's not the kind of thing you would expect the one who is anointed to be king to say. Keep it to yourselves. But there's a reason for that. He has a trip to make first. He has some things to accomplish first. And in verse 22, he tells us what those are. He charged them and commanded them, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So they know we're on our way to Jerusalem, because that's the only place where you can get those three groups of people together to reject Jesus. And Jesus is going to die. In the Matthew version, that's when Peter pulls him aside and says, wait a minute, you're the Messiah. That can't happen. And right away, Jesus had to correct him again. Jesus is telling him, we've got a trip to make. Now, when you consider he's farther north than he's ever been, and he's actually been moving north to get there, he's going to make an abrupt U-turn, and he's not going to make any side trips. He's going straight south to Jerusalem at this point. Knowing he's going to die, he made sure they knew that. I'm going to die. And perhaps the reason he didn't want his true identity publicized is included in verses 23 through 26, where he talks about the considerations that a believer would have to make. He says, and he said to all, notice not just the apostles at this point, but to all the people who are following him, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. It's going to cost Jesus something to go to Jerusalem. It's going to cost his life. But it's going to win more than it's going to cost. And he's telling them to be sure to recognize that if you decide to follow me, it's going to cost you something. I love the way he says this. He said in the first verse there, 23, he says, if anyone would come after me, like an invitation to go to Jerusalem with him, that he must deny himself. I'll tell you honestly, I really admire it when I hear a guy say, you know, I'd take a bullet for my wife, or I'd die for my kids. But that's not what this verse is talking about. This is a deeper sacrifice. This is more than just ending it all. This is actually looking at your life and all your dreams and all your aspirations and all the things you've invested in, your time and your talent, all the hopes that you've had for the future, and saying, Those don't matter anymore. I don't want to even invest in those anymore. In order to take up my cross. And I don't think we really understand what that phrase meant either. We have this tendency to picture the crucifix with Jesus hanging there in the dignity of the Son of God, dying for the sins of the world, making this honorable sacrifice. But crucifixion was nothing like that. Crucifixion was the most humiliating and painful way to die ever devised by human beings. In fact, we still use the word excruciation, which is the Latin word for out of the cross. The deepest, hardest, most costly pains, physically and emotionally, are minute compared to the agony the cross can cause. And people who saw crucifixions on a regular basis knew it. And they knew when the Romans put that cross on you, it doesn't matter what your dreams were before, because in about 48 or 72 hours, you're going to be dead, because it would take about that long to die on a cross. But notice Jesus doesn't say in this verse, pick up your cross and follow me. He says, take up your cross daily and follow me. It's a daily challenge to set aside those worldly benefits, the worldly ambitions that we have from our youth or our pre-salvation days. It's a challenge to say, none of that really matters as long as I get to be with Jesus. Jesus tells us that it's worth it. He goes on to say, because if you'll do that, if you won't let the shame of that drive you away from me, then I'll recognize you in the presence of my Father. But if you're ashamed of that, there's no reason for me to be proud of you on Judgment Day. I'm comforted by the fact he doesn't say you'll lose your salvation. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that there will be issues there. Still be hindrances to the relationship. I thank God that he will deal with those. And according to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he'll deal with those and we will still be saved, even though if it might be a great loss. Jesus had to deal with change. And he dealt with it on Mount Hermon in front of a pagan temple and invited his apostles to go with him. From this story, I would like to point out 4 principles about change. The first is that change has to be acknowledged. We never get anywhere by burying our head in the sand and saying we don't have to face that issue. There's a church just around the corner here that has just this last week or so had to make some very difficult, very painful decisions. And if you followed it in the newspaper, you might think that came up pretty suddenly, but I've known the pastor there for, I won't use names because this is being recorded, but I've known that pastor now for about 10 years, and I've known that this has been coming for a number of years, and they've faced this change honestly and up front with their people and with the people they needed to change with, and have finally decided to make a break with a denomination that's not following the Scripture. And they know what it feels like to have to not bury your head in the sand and face that something significant is happening. I also learned from Jesus that we have to time it correctly. Jesus took his people away from ministry and went north, outside of the normal territory where he worked in Galilee, to another country, basically, so that he can spend time with his apostles. And it strikes me that he did not consider turning south again until Peter made his declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus knew, they've got it. Now we can move to the next phase. Now the time is right for change. He's also very upfront with us that change frequently leads to unavoidable suffering. The church that had to make the change down the street here, they know what that suffering is because they've already lost friends. They've already seen people leave their congregation. And it may be years before new people come. But Jesus does, as the fourth principle says, ensures that it's worth the change. If it's handled properly, Jesus is going to honor it. And Jesus is going to make sure that the people who suffer through it receive the honor that only He can give. In essence, what I'm saying here is that Jesus boldly managed the change that was coming. In His case, it was a change of direction and a change of ministry style. And because He did that, we can face change too. We've learned from Him how to manage the changes that are in our life. The changes need to be acknowledged. The change that all of us will face, changes in family when kids are born, changes when marriages happen or when loved ones die. We need to acknowledge that all of us, the crass way to say it is that nobody gets off of planet Earth alive. Change is going to happen. We need to acknowledge it. In many cases, we need to choose the right time for that change. And that involves, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the deacons and the board here at Grace, because I don't have to make those decisions by myself. There are wise men who can say, it's time, or it's not time, or we need to pray first, or we need to address these other foundational issues first. And they see things that I don't see. No one man can see all of it. And as a plurality of leadership work together, our timing is wiser. And as we face changes in our life, we have to face the discomforts. Because there's no change that's comfortable. We had a baby in our house yesterday, and I noticed that it came time to change the baby's diapers. And it reminded me of the old joke, nobody likes change except babies with dirty diapers, and even they cry about it. It's uncomfortable, but we have to face it. And part of facing it is keeping that reward in front of us. When somebody's going through a change and it's very uncomfortable and they're confused or they're in pain, we can remind them that there's a reward coming. If nothing else, Jesus will reward us for our faithful following Him. The hard thing about change is waiting for that reward. Sometimes that reward comes years afterwards. Sometimes that reward doesn't come on this earth at all. Sometimes living by faith is knowing that Jesus will make that promise sure, but not while we're still in the body. It may come after we've gone into His presence. And that's why I think maybe the most significant change that a person on earth needs to make, the best change ever that a person could make, is that change from relying on their own righteousness or denying that God exists, or that denying that God maybe exists, but He's not significant, and recognizing that He's real and that our sins have separated us from Him. And only Jesus can pay the price of those sins. And we have to decide whether we're going to stay on Mount Hermon among the pagans, or we're going to follow Jesus to Jerusalem and all the danger and all the frustration and all the criticism and all the fear that go with it. See, Jesus is honest. If you put your faith in him, he'll tell you exactly what you're going to get. He'll get even clearer as he gets closer to Jerusalem. But we have to decide. Are we really going to follow? Are we going to take up our cross? Or are we going to give him lip service? Are we going to talk Jesus around Jesus people and talk politics around worldly people? That's the real change that has to take place before any of the rest of it makes any difference. The truth is, because Jesus faced change and it was recorded for us how he faced change, we learn how to face change too. And we're comforted by the fact that he went through the same discomforts that we went through. He came out the other side and promised we will too.